The barking would not stop. Not once, not twice, but over and over, sharp and furious, echoing across the dead ranch yard until even the wind seemed to step back and listen. The retired Navy SEAL came out of the sagging barn with a wrench still in one hand and froze when he saw the black-and-tan German Shepherd circling the old dry well at the edge of the property, claws tearing at the dirt, ears locked forward, body vibrating with the kind of warning that had once made armed men back away from doors in the dark. The dog had been restless since dawn, pacing, sniffing, stopping at nothing. But this was different. This was not curiosity. This was urgency. "Ranger!" he shouted, already moving. The shepherd did not come. It barked again,
Wait, the
this
case!
time, then planted itself at the cracked stone rim and stared straight down into the black shaft as if something below had just looked back. If this doesn't grab you by the throat, nothing will, because what waited in that well was not supposed to be there. And the dog knew it before the man did. He crossed the yard fast, boots slamming packed dirt, old shoulder pain flaring under his faded work shirt. The ranch had belonged to his uncle once, then to no one, and now, if the bank had its way, it would belong to somebody who had never buried blood in foreign soil and pretended life could still be simple afterward. He had come out here for silence, for distance, for the kind of hard work that left no room for memory. But memory had followed him anyway. It always did. Ranger barked again and backed away from the well 2 steps, then lunged forward and barked down into it, not at random, not wild, but in a pattern, as if answering something. Mason felt the old tightening in his ribs, that cold internal click that used to happen right before a breach, right before metal, right before somebody screamed. He hated how fast his body still remembered. He slowed at the rim and crouched beside the dog. Ranger's hackles were up. The shepherd's amber-brown eyes were fixed on the darkness below, unblinking, jaw tight, chest heaving. This was the same dog that had served 2 tours beside him, the same dog that had once refused to cross a courtyard in Kandahar seconds before mortar fire shredded it, the same dog that had dragged him by his vest strap when the blast took his hearing and almost took the rest of him too. When Ranger insisted something was wrong, wrong was usually the kindest version of the truth. Mason placed one hand lightly on the harness. "Easy," he said, but the words sounded thin in his own ears. Ranger let out a low growl without looking at him. Then came the sound. Faint. Hollow. A metallic tap from somewhere deep in the well, followed by a scrape that was definitely not stone shifting on stone. Mason's head snapped up. The yard was empty. The fence line bent in the heat. The windmill beyond the field hung motionless. No truck on the road. No voices. Yet every nerve in him rose at once. Ranger stepped closer to the rim again and barked harder, then suddenly stopped and listened, one front paw lifted. That silence hit worse than the barking. Mason leaned forward just enough to peer down. The well had been dry for years, at least from what his uncle used to say. 40 feet deep, maybe more, lined with old fieldstone blackened by time, choked by shadow. At first, he saw nothing but darkness and a faint circle of dust caught in the shaft. Then his eyes adjusted, and something pale flashed far below. Not water. Not rock. Something smooth. Something man-made. He narrowed his gaze. There, jammed against the far wall, half under a collapsed wooden platform, was a strip of silver-gray metal catching light from above. Too straight to be natural. Too clean to have been sitting there for decades. Ranger barked once more, hard enough to make Mason flinch, then turned and looked not at the well this time, but toward the far side of the yard, where the old pump shed leaned crooked under the cottonwoods. Mason followed the dog's stare and felt his mouth go dry. The shed door, which he knew he had left hanging half open that morning, was now closed. Not latched. Closed. He stared at it for a long second, and then Ranger gave a different sound, A shorter, sharper warning. Mason looked back into the well. The silver shape below had shifted. Just slightly. But enough. Enough that he knew he had not imagined it. He stood at once and stepped back from the rim, bringing Ranger with him by the harness. The dog resisted only for a heartbeat, then yielded, still staring down. Mason's mind ran through possibilities faster than fear could catch them. Dumped machinery. Old pipe. A trap. A body. Somebody hiding. But none of those explained the tapping. None of them explained why Ranger was reacting like this. He scanned the yard again, slower now. Rusted trough near the fence. Dead mesquite by the road. Pump shed. Barn. House. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling of being watched settled over him, so hard he could almost taste it. Ranger suddenly pressed against his leg, not out of fear, but to anchor him. That old move. Stay here. Stay now. Mason swallowed. The shepherd only did that when he felt Mason's breathing change, when the past started trying to drag him under. He let out a slow breath and forced his hand steady. "Okay," he whispered. "You found something. I get it." He pulled a flashlight from his belt, thumbed it on, and shone the beam down into the shaft. The light cut through dust and landed on the silver shape below, and this time his stomach dropped for real. It was not scrap. It was a steel case. Military green beneath the dust, corners reinforced, one latch hanging loose. And beside it, caught under the broken platform, was something else. Cloth. Dark. Folded. Mason adjusted the beam, pulse climbing. The cloth had a patch sewn onto it. Torn, dirty, but still visible enough to stop his breath halfway in his chest. A flag patch. American. Ranger whined low now, a sound that was somehow worse than barking. Then the flashlight beam caught one more thing, and Mason felt cold spread through him like a spill of ice water. Resting on top of the steel case was a dog collar. Worn leather. Working collar. With a metal plate bolted to the front. Ranger barked violently the instant the light touched it, as if recognizing something Mason hadn't yet allowed himself to believe. Mason lowered the light a fraction, then raised it again, hoping his eyes had lied. They had not. Even from 40 feet up, he could see the collar was not random ranch junk. It was tactical. Old service design. And on the metal plate, reflecting the flashlight in one tiny cruel flash, was a stamped number beginning with the exact same unit prefix he had spent years trying to forget. His mouth went dry. There was no way. No logical way. That well had been sealed in silence for years. No one out here should have had access to that kind of gear. No one should have known enough to put it where a retired handler and his ex-military dog would find it. Ranger's barking stopped again, so abruptly the empty yard seemed to lurch. The shepherd stood rigid, ears forward, staring past the beam into the darkness below. Mason followed the dog's gaze, and saw it too this time, not clearly, not fully, but enough. A shape withdrawing deeper under the broken platform, something human-sized shifting away from the light. He jerked backward from the rim just as a voice rose from the bottom of the dry well, hoarse, weak, and impossibly alive. "If that dog's still with you," it said, "don't let him jump." Mason's grip tightened on Ranger's harness so hard his knuckles burned white, but the dog was already pulling toward the rim again, not in panic now, but in fierce impatient certainty, as if that hoarse voice from below had flipped some ancient switch inside him. Mason forced himself to breathe once, slow and deep, and aimed the flashlight back into the shaft. "Say that again," he called, voice low, controlled, though his pulse had gone wild. For a second there was only dust drifting through the beam, the faint creak of old boards somewhere below, and the scrape of Ranger's claws on stone. Then the voice came back, weaker this time, but closer somehow, as if whoever owned it had dragged himself nearer to the wall just to be heard. "If that dog's still with you, keep him back." Ranger barked violently the instant the voice finished, then stopped and let out a strangled sound Mason had not heard in years, not since the last week overseas, when smoke, blood, and collapsing timber had taken one man and nearly taken the rest of them. That sound hit harder than the voice. It was recognition. Mason crouched beside the dog, one hand on the harness, the other steadying himself on the cracked stone rim. "Who are you?" he called down. Silence. Then a metallic tap. Then a cough so rough and wet it bounced up the well walls in ugly echoes. Mason's eyes tracked the beam lower. The steel case was real. The old service collar was real. The torn flag patch was real. And now, just beyond the broken platform, something shifted again, an arm maybe, or a shoulder tucked into shadow. Human. No doubt left now. Human. Every instinct in him screamed trap, and every memory he'd spent years burying began pushing up through the dirt of his mind at the same time. Wells, shafts, confined spaces, fake calls for help. He'd seen worse lures in worse places. But Ranger was not reacting to it like bait. He was reacting like he knew. That was the part Mason could not get around. The shepherd backed from the edge 2 steps, then sprang forward and barked down again, tail rigid, ears pinned so hard it looked cut from stone. Mason scanned the yard one more time. Pump shed closed. Windmill still dead. Fence line empty. The old farmhouse windows black. Yet he could feel eyes somewhere, or maybe memory had taught his body to invent them. He dropped the flashlight between his teeth, pulled the pistol from the back of his waistband, and listened. No shot. No movement. No second hidden voice. Just that dry cough from below and Ranger's agitated breathing. "Okay," Mason muttered, more to himself than the dog. "Okay." He crossed to the old tool rack nailed to the barn wall, and grabbed the coil of ranch rope hanging there, then a rusted iron hook, then the battered lantern he used when the generator failed. Ranger stayed at the rim, pacing now, turning from the well to the pump shed and back again, as if trying to track 2 dangers at once. Mason noticed that, and felt cold move through him. "You see something up there too, don't you?" Ranger gave one hard bark toward the shed without taking his eyes off the well. Rehook. New danger. Mason hated that he understood the dog well enough to hear the message inside it. Whatever was down there mattered. Whatever might be watching from the yard mattered too. He tied the rope off around the base of the windmill post, tested it twice, clipped the iron hook through his belt loop, and then hesitated when Ranger shoved against his hip so hard he nearly lost balance. "No," Mason snapped, instinct sharper than emotion. "Not you." The shepherd barked in his face, furious now, and tried again to pull toward the shaft. Mason caught the harness with both hands and brought the dog nose to nose with him. Ranger's eyes were wild, not with fear, but with the same raw urgency Mason had once seen when the dog had smelled men buried under rubble. "Listen to me," he said, voice dropping. "You jump, you die. You hear me?" Ranger gave a low chest-deep rumble, then abruptly stopped fighting and pressed his forehead against Mason's shoulder. That broke something small and dangerous open inside him, because that had always been the dog's way of telling him 2 things at once. "I understand, and hurry." Mason swallowed hard, clipped the flashlight to his jacket, slung the lantern low from the rope line, and lowered it carefully into the shaft first. Warm yellow light bloomed down the stone walls, pushing the darkness back just enough to show the broken platform more clearly. It had collapsed inward years ago, but someone, had dragged the steel case closer beneath it recently. Fresh scraped lines marked the dust. Recent. Very recent. Mason's stomach tightened. He eased himself over the rim and started down the old iron ladder spikes set into the inner wall, boots finding chipped stone, one hand on the rope, one on the pistol. Above him, Ranger paced the circle of the well like a sentry on the edge of a battlefield, panting hard enough that Mason could hear it descending with him. 10 feet down, the air changed. Cooler. Staler. Carrying the dry mineral smell of old earth and something else underneath it, oil, mildew, and a trace of infection that made him clench his jaw. 15 feet. The lantern swung, casting ugly shadows. 20. Then came the sound again, closer now. Breathing. Human breathing, thin and ragged, scraping its way in and out of a chest already half spent. Mason reached the broken platform level and braced himself on the last intact beam. The figure below flinched at the lantern light and tried to pull deeper under the platform, but there was nowhere left to go. "Don't move," Mason said automatically, because it was what training gave him when everything else failed. The laugh that answered was barely a breath. "Been down here 3 days," the voice rasped. "Not planning on sprinting." Mason lowered himself the last few feet and landed in dust beside the steel case. Up close, the service collar hit him first. It was old issue all right, but not Ranger's. Too narrow. Different buckle. The unit prefix on the plate still matched though, and beneath the grime there were scratches cut into the leather by teeth, desperate repetitive marks, like a dog had once tried to yank it free from something. Mason's pulse thudded harder. He turned the beam toward the man under the platform. Late 40s, maybe 50s. Beard matted with dust. One eye swollen nearly shut. Shirt torn open at the shoulder. Left leg trapped under a slab of rotten timber, not crushed, but pinned badly enough to keep him from crawling out. There was a canteen by his hand, empty. Blood had dried black down one sleeve. Not dead. Not far from it either. But it was the face that stopped Mason cold. Not because he knew the man. Because he almost did. Something about the jawline. The brows. The scar cutting through the beard on the right side. Familiar in the way old photographs became familiar after too many sleepless nights. Ranger erupted above, barking so hard dust sifted from the stone. The trapped man shut his eyes at the sound, and when he opened them again, there was something broken and almost disbelieving in his stare. "He really made it," he whispered. Mason's skin went tight. "You know my dog?" The man tried to laugh, failed, and coughed instead. "Know that bark better than my own pulse." Mason took one step closer, pistol still trained but lowering despite himself. "Who are you?" The man's gaze slid to the steel case instead of answering. "Open it," he said. "Then ask me again." Mason did not move. "Not how this works." The man drew a painful breath. "Then keep wasting time. They'll be back before you get your answer." Rehook. New threat. Mason's head snapped upward instinctively, as if he could see through 40 feet of stone. Ranger had stopped barking again. That silence was worse. Much worse. Mason crouched by the steel case. One latch was already loose. The second had been bit outward with something sharp. Recently. Mud still clung under the hinge. He looked back at the trapped man. "Who put you here?" The man's expression changed. Not fear, not exactly, but something darker, older. "The same people who buried that case," he said. "And if you don't open it now, they'll bury you too." Mason slid the pistol into a ready low position, reached for the latch, then stopped when Ranger exploded overhead with a different bark, frantic and repeated, aimed not down the shaft this time, but out across the ranch. Mason froze. Footsteps. Faint at first. Then unmistakable. Not one set. More than one. Crunching over dry dirt toward the yard. The trapped man heard it too, and for the first time real fear cracked through the dust and pain on his face. "Too late," he whispered. Mason snapped the latch open anyway. The steel lid lifted 2 inches, then 4, then jammed against something inside. He shoved harder. The lid gave. Lantern light spilled across a stack of waterproof packets, an old satellite radio, a folded map, and one photograph lying face up on top of everything. Mason looked down, and the world narrowed to a single brutal point. The photograph showed a younger version of himself, bleeding and half-conscious, being dragged through smoke by a military dog. But it was not Ranger in the picture. And the man dragging him was the same face now staring up at him from the bottom of the well. Mason stared at the photograph in the lantern light until the edges of it seemed to pulse. Younger. Bleeding. Half-conscious. Smoke everywhere. A military dog dragging him by the vest strap through a curtain of sparks. And the man hauling his upper body out of the blast zone was the same one now trapped under the broken platform, filthy, gaunt, and somehow alive at the bottom of a dry ranch well. For one suspended second, Mason forgot the footsteps above, forgot the yard, forgot even the dog barking himself ragged overhead. All he could feel was that old mission pressure returning behind his ribs, the same one that had followed him home for years and turned sleep into punishment. "No," he whispered, but it was not denial so much as disbelief looking for somewhere to land. The trapped man coughed again, harsher now, and the sound broke the moment open. "You can tell me I'm seeing things after we're not dead," he rasped. Ranger exploded above them with another burst of barking, not down the shaft this time, but aimed hard across the ranch. Mason snapped back into motion. He shoved the photograph into his jacket, pulled the folded map and the radio from the case in one fast sweep, and looked up the well. Footsteps again. Closer. Crunching dry dirt. More than one pair. Whoever was crossing the yard was not trying to hide it anymore. That was worse. Men who stopped hiding usually believed they were about to win. Mason dropped into a crouch beside the trapped stranger. Up close the man looked even worse than he had at first glance. Fever in the eyes. Lips split. Left leg pinned under a beam that had crushed just enough to lock him, not enough to shatter bone clean. Deliberate, Mason thought suddenly. Not a cave-in accident. A trap built to keep a man alive and helpless until someone came back to finish the job. Rehook. New realization. New danger. "Who the hell are you?" Mason said, keeping his voice low and hard. The man looked at him for a long second, like he was deciding whether the truth would matter more than the seconds it cost. Then Ranger's bark changed above into a deep, violent growl, followed by the unmistakable metallic clink of the old well crank being touched. Somebody was right at the rim now. The trapped man's face tightened. "Later," he said. "Lift first." Mason did not argue. He shoved the pistol into his waistband, jammed his shoulder under the beam, and heaved. Pain lit through his bad shoulder instantly, but the wood shifted half an inch. The trapped man sucked air through his teeth and clawed at the dirt with both hands. Not enough. Mason repositioned, hooked the iron pry bar from the case under the beam, and drove down with his weight. Wood groaned. Dust rained. The beam rose just enough for the man to wrench his leg free with a strangled cry that scraped the stone walls raw. Above them, everything went silent. Not dog silence. Human silence. The kind that meant someone was listening. Mason felt it like a knife along the spine. Ranger did not bark. He gave one low rumble instead, and Mason knew exactly what that meant. They were standing right there. The man beside him was trying not to pass out, breath coming fast and ugly. Mason grabbed him by the front of his torn shirt and dragged him behind the steel case just as a flashlight beam knifed down into the well from above. Bright. White. Searching. Mason killed the lantern with one fast twist, plunging the bottom of the shaft into dark broken only by the pale circles spilling from above. He flattened with the trapped man against the stone, one hand over the man's mouth before he could cough again. Ranger snarled overhead, fierce and close, and then came a new sound, boots shifting back from the rim. Somebody cursed softly. Another voice answered, too low to make out the words. Mason's blood turned to ice. Two voices. Maybe three. Men, from the depth of him. Ranger barked once, sharp and furious, then yelped as if shoved. Mason's hand tightened involuntarily over the stranger's jaw. The man's eyes flared wide in the dark. Mason could not breathe for a second. Ranger never yelped unless contact had already happened. He counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Then the dog came back with a savage roar of barking that echoed down the shaft like gunfire. Good. Still fighting. Still up. Mason let go of the stranger's mouth. Can you climb? He whispered. The man almost laughed, but there was nothing alive enough in him to make it real. If you throw me out of a helicopter, maybe. Mason risked one glance upward. The flashlight beam moved off the rim. Then came the dry hiss of rope sliding over stone. Someone was sending something down. Not coming down themselves. Sending something. Mason's mind ran through possibilities too fast. Camera, hook, charge, gas, and none of them were good. Ranger's barking shifted again, farther from the well now, then back toward it, then away. He's being pulled off, Mason realized. Or he's pulling them away. Either way, the dog was buying seconds with his own body. Mason looked at the stranger. Name. The man's face was a pale slash in the dark. Tell you when we're moving. Now! Another hiss from above. Whatever was descending scraped the stone wall as it came. The stranger shut his eyes for one pained second, then opened them again. Cole, he said. That enough for now? Mason's pulse kicked harder. The name hit somewhere old and half-buried, not clean memory, not yet, but close enough to tighten his throat. Cole. There had been a Cole around that mission, not on his direct team, not one of the dead, but adjacent to the operation somehow. A support element, maybe extraction side, maybe intel. Mason had spent years trying not to pull those names back into the light. Now one of them was in a well with him, and armed men were lowering something down to erase both of them. The descending object swung into the flashlight beam from above, and Mason saw it clearly enough to curse. Not a man. Not a hook. A metal canister with holes punched around the sides. He knew that shape. Knew it too fast. Smoke deployment. Maybe tear gas. Maybe worse in a confined shaft this deep. Cole saw it too. They don't want a clean body, he whispered. They want panic. Mason grabbed the steel case, shoved the radio and the folded map into his jacket, then hooked one arm under Cole's shoulders. Then we move first. The old well had no side tunnel, no drainage cut, no easy miracle waiting in the stone. Just ladder spikes running up one wall, and 40 feet of exposed shaft beneath armed men who now knew exactly where he was. Impossible angles had never stopped him before. They were not stopping him now. He hauled Cole upright. The man nearly collapsed instantly, left leg buckling under him. Mason locked an arm around his waist and half-dragged, half-carried him toward the ladder's side, while the canister descended another 10 feet above. Ranger's barking surged back to the rim again, savage enough that someone shouted. Then came a grunt, a scuffle, and the sudden sound of a body hitting dirt. One of them went down, Mason thought with a savage spike of hope. Of course he did. Ranger had always hit faster than men expected. Mason got Cole to the wall and shoved him against the stones. Climb with your hands. I push. Cole's laugh this time was a broken wheeze. Still giving orders. Still alive, aren't you? Mason shot back. Cole's expression changed at that, only for a flicker, but it was enough to show something deeper than pain, recognition, old and ugly and personal. Before Mason could push it, the canister above clanged against the wall and began spitting white smoke through its vents. Not tear gas. Denser. Faster. Heavy smoke meant to blind, choke, confuse. In a shaft this narrow, it would bury them in seconds. Cole looked up once and whispered, "Here we go!" Mason planted his boot under Cole's good foot and drove him upward toward the first ladder spike. Above, Ranger barked again, closer to the opening, and then came the sound of snapping wood from the old well-cover frame. Mason glanced up through the first tendrils of smoke and saw something impossible and magnificent at once. Ranger had gotten onto the old crank platform above the well and was wrenching at the rotten support brace with his teeth and body weight, not randomly, but with that same fierce, focused intelligence he'd used overseas when no one else yet understood where the danger was. Mason's eyes widened. The brace held the pulley arm. If that arm came down, the rope, the smoke canister, maybe the men at the rim, everything would shift at once. Rehook. New chance. New danger. "Ranger!" Mason shouted before he could stop himself. The shepherd barked once in answer, a hard, furious sound full of effort. Cole was coughing now, climbing with one leg dragging, hands slipping on iron slick with age. Smoke thickened, turning the shaft into a white choking throat. Mason shoved from below, one hand on Cole's boot, one on his belt, lungs already burning. Above, the old crank shrieked. Wood splintered. Someone yelled. Then the entire pulley arm gave way with a cracking roar, and as it ripped sideways across the mouth of the well, the last thing Mason saw through the falling smoke was Ranger lunging straight at the man holding the flashlight, just as both of them disappeared over the edge. For one impossible heartbeat, Mason saw nothing but motion, splintered wood, a hard white flashlight beam spinning through the smoke, Ranger's black antennaed body launching out of it with all 4 feet off the broken frame, and the man at the rim vanishing backward into the dawn, with a shout cut short by the collapse of the pulley arm. Then everything hit at once. The old iron structure screamed, the smoke canister slammed against the stone wall and burst harder, and the bottom of the well turned into a choking white throat. Cole coughed so violently beside him he nearly folded in half. Mason grabbed him by the vest and shoved him upward toward the ladder spikes. "Move!" he barked, because thinking about the dog right now would kill all 3 of them. Cole climbed 2 rungs on instinct, slipped, recovered, then dragged himself higher on raw need alone. Mason pushed from below, one hand on Cole's boot, the other over his own mouth, as the smoke thickened and burned the inside of his nose. Above them came a brutal mess of sound, boots skidding on stone, one man cursing in pain, the crash of the fallen pulley, then a bark so deep and furious it punched straight through the smoke and into Mason's chest. Ranger was still alive. That single fact hit him like oxygen. "Good boy," he coughed before the words turned to grit in his throat. Rehook. Hope. Then a gunshot cracked overhead. Stone chips sprayed down the shaft. Not hope. Not yet. Mason shoved Cole higher. "Climb!" Cole was gasping now, injured leg dragging uselessly, but he kept going. 5 feet. 10. The shaft narrowed with smoke above them until the circle of dawn became a dirty blur. Mason climbed after him, boots scraping iron spikes, lungs starting to fail one breath at a time. Halfway up, something heavy struck the inner wall above and came tumbling down through the haze. He turned his face just in time to avoid a boot heel and caught a glimpse of a man's body bouncing off the ladder spikes, limp or nearly limp, then slamming onto the broken platform below with a sick crack. The same man Ranger had hit. Mason did not stop to see if he was dead. He climbed. Above, Ranger barked once, short and sharp, then again from farther back, as if circling the rim. Hurting. Guarding. Buying time? That dog was still fighting a whole battlefield by himself. Mason's chest tightened with something more dangerous than fear. Pride. The kind that made people do stupid things. He crushed it down and kept moving. Cole reached the top first, grabbed the broken stone lip with both hands, and tried to haul himself over. His bad leg folded under him at once. Mason braced beneath him and drove upward with his shoulder. Cole spilled over the rim in a grunt of pain. Mason reached for the top at the same moment a shadow crossed above him. He looked up through the smoke and saw a second man, not the one who had fallen, crouched at the edge with a revolver gripped two-handed and pointed straight down into the shaft. Mason dropped 3 spikes in the same instant the gun fired. The round slammed into stone where his face had been and ricocheted screaming into the white haze. Above, Ranger hit the shooter from the side with so much force the man's shoulders snapped sideways, and the second shot went wild across the yard. Mason heard flesh hit dirt, heard Ranger snarling like something pulled from war itself, then heard the ugly thud of a boot catching the dog in the ribs. The sound that came out of Mason at that was not a word. It was older than that. He lunged upward again, coming out of the shaft in a blast of smoke and daylight with the pistol in his hand and murder in his pulse. The yard had become a spinning broken picture. One man lay twisted near the fallen pulley frame, unmoving. Another was on his back in the dirt with Ranger on top of him, the shepherd's jaws locked on the man's forearm, while he tried desperately to keep the revolver away from his own throat. And beyond them, near the pump shed, a third figure was running. Not charging in. Running away, with something slung under one arm. Mason's eyes locked on it at once. A long rectangular metal box. Another case. The real target had never been the well alone. The well had been bait, noise, a delay. Somebody had come to retrieve something from the pump shed while the smoke and the gunfire kept him blind. Rehook. New theft. Bigger plan. Mason swung the pistol toward the runner, but Ranger gave a strangled bark behind him, and Mason had to choose in half a heartbeat. The dog or the man with the case? He chose the dog. Of course he did. He crossed the yard in 3 strides and drove his boot into the armed man's wrist just as the revolver turned toward Ranger's chest. Bone popped. The gun flew. Ranger released the arm and sprang clear on command. He had not even needed to hear. Mason dropped hard onto the attacker, slammed one forearm across the man's throat, and brought the pistol down under the jawline. "Who are you?" he snarled. The man only smiled through bloody teeth. That smile chilled him more than the gun had. It was not brave. It was certain. Then Ranger wheeled away from them both and barked toward the pump shed with such violent urgency that Mason did not waste another second. He smashed the pistol butt into the man's temple, rose, and ran. Cole, somehow back on his feet despite the leg, was limping after the third man with a broken shovel handle in both hands, like he planned to stop a truck with it. "He's got it!" Cole shouted. Mason saw the runner reach the shed door, yank it open, and disappear inside with the second metal case. Mason pushed harder. Ranger beat them there by a full second, hit the shed threshold, then stopped dead instead of going in. That stop hit Mason like a slap. Ranger only froze at doorways when there was a reason. Wired entry? Trip line. Blast. Mason caught Cole by the chest and hauled him sideways behind an old tractor axle just as the pump shed exploded. Not a full fireball. Worse. A brutal contained detonation that turned the doorway into a mouth of splintered wood, nails, and rusted metal. The blast wave knocked dust from the cottonwoods and slammed heat across Mason's face. Ranger had already dropped flat the instant before it went, ears pinned, body tight to the dirt. Cole was not fast enough. The shockwave lifted him off one foot and hurled him backward into the dry trough. Mason hit the ground hard, rolled, came up coughing, and looked for the dog first. Ranger was on his feet, shaken but alive, barking at the blown-open shed through drifting smoke and flying insulation. Good. Good. Mason ran to Cole. Blood on the forehead. Eyes open. Breathing ugly but alive. Cole grabbed Mason's sleeve with surprising strength. "Inside," he coughed. "He didn't make it out." Mason looked toward the shed. Smoke poured from the doorway. Roof half collapsed inward. No movement visible. Yet Ranger was not barking like it was over. The dog stood at the edge of the wreckage, stiff, tail level, staring not into the flames, but to the right of them, toward the old water tank behind the shed. Mason turned, and saw the runner there, alive, stumbling from behind the tank with the second metal case still under one arm and a short shotgun in the other hand. The man was burned down one sleeve, face blackened by soot, but moving fast enough. Too fast. Mason raised his pistol. So did the runner. They both froze for the smallest fraction of a second. Then Ranger moved first, launching not at the shotgun, not at the man's throat, but at the case itself. The dog hit it broadside with all his weight. The case ripped free, flew from the man's arm, struck the tank ladder, and burst open on impact. Papers blew everywhere across the yard like white birds in dirty wind. Photographs, maps, plastic-sealed documents, and one smaller item that landed separately near Mason's boot with a metallic clatter, a tarnished silver tag on a broken chain. He looked down. The stamped lettering hit him like a blade slid under the ribs. It was another military ID tag. Not Cole's. Not the dead man's. Not anyone he'd expected to see again. It was his own. The one he had lost the night of the mission everyone said he survived alone. He stared at it for one stunned second, and in that second the runner fired. Ranger hit Mason in the chest before the blast reached him. Both of them crashed backward into the dirt as buckshot tore through the space where Mason's heart had been. When he twisted back up with the pistol ready and rage flooding his hands, the runner was already retreating toward the tree line, smoke behind him, stolen papers whipping through the air, and Cole shouting something Mason barely heard because all he could see was Ranger sprawled half across him, breathing hard, eyes open, but blood beginning to spread through the black fur along the dog's side. Mason did not feel himself move. 1 second, he was staring at the blood spreading through Ranger's black fur, and the next he was on both knees in the dirt with one hand buried in the dog's side, searching for the wound while the papers from the burst-open case whipped across the yard like white birds in dirty wind. Ranger's breathing came hard and shallow, but his eyes were still locked on the tree line where the shooter had vanished. Good. Still tracking. Still with him. Mason's fingers found torn fur, hot skin, and a groove of blood along the ribs, but no pumping hole, no catastrophic spray. Buckshot graze. Bad. Painful. Not fatal. Relief hit too hard to look like relief. It came out as anger. "Stay down," he snapped, already ripping off his belt to cinch pressure around the dog's middle. Ranger ignored the command, tried to rise, failed once, then succeeded on the second attempt and swung his head toward the papers scattered across the yard. Rehook. New clue. New urgency. Cole limped toward them from the trough, face gray with pain, shovel handle still clutched like a useless spear. "He take everything?" Mason shot back without looking up. "No," Cole said, breathing hard. "He dropped what mattered most." Mason followed his stare. Across the dirt, caught against the broken wheel of the old tractor, one photograph had not blown away. It lay face up, trembling under the wind. Mason recognized the image before he reached it because he recognized the feeling first, the sensation of old memory being pulled out by force. He scooped the photograph up. Another shot from the same mission. Smoke. Fire. The timber compound. Himself half conscious again, dragged by that unknown military dog. But this image was wider. Wider meant context. And the context hit like a hammer. 3 armed men stood in the background near the extraction bird. One was waving people back from the burning east side. One was looking straight at the camera. And the third, partly turned, wore a handler's harness lead around one arm, except the dog on the line was missing from the frame, as if it had torn free toward the fire. Mason's jaw locked. He turned the photo over. There was writing on the back. Not old ink. Recent marker. He kept going back for the same voice. Ranger, despite the blood and the bandage, pushed his muzzle under Mason's hand and huffed once, urgently, then turned toward the scattered papers. Mason understood immediately. "Show me!" The shepherd limped off 3 paces and stopped over one of the sealed packets that had burst from the case. Mason tore it open. Inside was a folded grid map of the ranch, but not the ranch as it was now. The ranch as if someone had studied it like a battlefield. The house marked in red. The barn in blue. The well circled twice. The pump shed boxed and labeled cash too. The north field carried another mark that froze him colder than the shotgun had, an X drawn beside the words Old Graves/False. "False graves?" Cole said behind him, voice gone thin. Mason did not answer. Because under the map was a second sheet, a roster page, water-damaged but still readable. Some names were blacked out. Some unit numbers were gone. But one line remained clear enough to gut the air right out of him. Canine response log. Subject fixated on subterranean acoustic source. Handler overruled. Mason read it twice. Then a third time. Handled, recorded, filed. They had known. Not guessed. Known. Somebody had written down that a military dog had locked onto a hidden voice below ground and had been ignored anyway. The rage that rose in him felt old enough to have been waiting years for exactly this paper. Ranger barked suddenly, not loud, just once, sharp and directional, toward the field beyond the cottonwoods. Mason snapped up. There. Movement. Not the runner this time. Something lower. 2 figures cutting along the fence line, trying to stay beneath sight. Men. Closing back in. "How many of them?" Cole rasped. Mason didn't answer immediately because a worse thought had just arrived. The runner had fled with nothing secured. The well trap had failed. The shed charge had failed. That meant the people doing this were not improvising. They were working through layers. They would not just come back for the papers. They would come back for the man in the well, for the dog, for him, and for whatever was still hidden under Old Graves/False. Mystery deepened. Not one buried secret. A whole burial ground of lies. Ranger barked again, harder, then turned unexpectedly not toward the field, but toward Cole. The dog stared at him with such fixed intensity that even Cole went still. Mason noticed it at once. "What?" Cole swallowed. "Don't look at me like that." Ranger moved closer, nose working, then pressed against Cole's injured leg and immediately recoiled with a deep, low growl. Mason's eyes narrowed. Blood. Dirt. Sweat. And something else. A smell on Cole that Ranger had just recognized. Not enemy exactly. Familiar. Mason rose slowly, pistol in hand again. "You said later," he said. "It's later." Cole looked from the gun to the dog and back again. "You really want it now? You dragged me out of a fire in that photo," Mason said. "You ended up in my well. Men are trying to erase this ranch like it's a battlefield. My dog knows you from somewhere he shouldn't. So yes, I want it now." Cole's face changed. Not into fear. Into exhaustion so deep it almost looked like surrender. "I wasn't on your team," he said at last. "I was attached after the first breach failed. Recovery side. Containment side, they called it later, when they wanted nicer language for ugly work. Mason's pulse kicked harder. Containment of what? Cole looked at the map in Mason's hand. Whatever was under that compound. Same thing they'd buried pieces of out here. Same thing they're willing to kill for now. Ranger's growl deepened. That's not an answer. Cole nodded once, like he deserved that. No, it's not. Because the real answer is worse. Footsteps cracked through the north field. Closer this time. No more sneaking. The two figures had abandoned caution. Mason swore, grabbed the scattered pages he could reach, shoved them under his jacket, and looped one arm under Cole's shoulder. Can you move? Can I move? And can I run our very different conversations? We're having the first one. Ranger was already limping toward the far side of the yard, not the house, not the barn, but the low stone line beyond the mesquite where the old family graves sat under broken crosses and sunburnt weeds. Mason followed, dragging Cole with him. Bullets had not started yet, and that meant the men in the field still thought they could retrieve this quietly. Good. Let them keep thinking that. The old graves came into view through the grass. 3 headstones, 1 cracked angel, dry earth, nothing else. Yet Ranger did not stop at the markers. He ran straight past them to a patch of ground between the second and third stones and began barking, not at the field, not at the men closing in, but straight at the dirt. Mason felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. The map. Old grave/false. He shoved Cole down behind the nearest marker and dropped beside the barking dog. The ground here looked ordinary except for one detail. The soil was too smooth. No weeds. No sink. No proper settling for something that old. Freshly redressed. Deliberately maintained. Mason dug his fingers into the dirt, swept once, and hit wood almost instantly. A lid. Not coffin deep. Shallow. Hidden storage. Ranger barked harder and pawed at the edge with furious precision. From the field came the first shout. Stop right there! Then came the first shot, slamming stone chips off the angel statue over Mason's head. He didn't even flinch. He jammed the pry bar from the burst case under the hidden lid and drove down with all the strength left in his shoulder. The wood cracked open just enough for him to see inside, and the breath left his chest. No body. No bones. No grave at all. Just another steel container, and laid across the top of it, folded with impossible care, was a weather-faded K9 vest with one torn-named strip still attached. The strip read only one word. Echo. Ranger went dead silent the instant Mason read it. Then, from somewhere under the hidden container, something electronic gave a single clear beep. The beep was small, almost polite, but it cut through the gunfire and the barking and the dry wind like the sound of a fuse being kissed awake. Mason's whole body locked for half a heartbeat, then training took over, and he yanked the weather-faded K9 vest clear of the hidden container, while Ranger sprang backward from the open false grave with a savage bark. Another shot cracked from the north field and shattered the top corner of the nearest headstone, spraying white stone dust across Mason's face. Cole dropped flatter behind the grave marker, one arm over his bad leg, the other already clawing for the steel box beneath the vest. Don't touch it like that! Mason snapped, but Cole had already seen what Mason saw an instant later. The beep had come from a small black unit taped under the lip of the hidden container, no bigger than a deck of cards, with a blinking red light and 2 wires running deeper beneath the box. Not just a tracker. Not just an alarm. A failsafe. Ranger barked again and wheeled toward the field, teeth bared, then swung back to the hole, as if he could not decide which danger would kill them first. Mason drove the pry bar under the steel box and levered it up just enough to see underneath. More wire. More recent than everything else. Someone had laid this after the false grave was prepared, not years ago, not forgotten, recently, carefully, waiting for the exact moment the box was disturbed. Rehook. New danger. New layer. Can you kill it? Cole rasped. Mason's jaw tightened. Maybe. The truth was worse. In a field, under fire, with Ranger half bleeding, Cole half mobile, and armed men closing fast, maybe meant almost nothing. He ripped his knife free and cut around the tape holding the black unit to the lip, careful, slow, every muscle in his hands forced still while bullets cracked over the graves and Ranger barked himself raw at the field line. The red light blinked once. Twice. Faster now. Mason followed the wires with his eyes. One disappeared under the box. The second ran sideways into the dirt wall of the false grave. That meant anti-lift and secondary charge, or anti-tamper and remote signal. Either way, bad. Very bad. Cole sucked air through his teeth. They're pushing closer. Mason didn't look up. I know. He could hear them now between shots, boots and dry grass, men moving with the confidence of people who believed the grave would finish the work for them. Ranger suddenly stopped barking and gave a deep, rolling growl toward the west instead. Mason's head snapped that way. Another figure. Not from the field. From the ranch road. Moving fast between the dead mesquite. The runner from the pump shed, the one Ranger had knocked the case from. He was circling back in, shotgun gone, pistol out now, trying to come at them from the flank while the others kept pressure from the front. Layer on layer. Cole saw him too and swore under his breath. They're herding us onto the grave. Mason cut the first wire. Nothing happened. The red light kept blinking. He cut the second. The beeping stopped. For one dangerous second relief tried to rise in him. Then the whole steel container gave a tiny mechanical click from somewhere deeper inside. Delayed trigger. Not disarmed. Shifted. Mason shoved the vest at Cole. Run. Cole stared at him. What? Take the vest and run. Another shot tore dirt from the grave lip. Ranger lunged toward the west flank, hit the runner at knee height, and both vanished into the grass in a snarling collision of black antan fur and gray dust. Mason did not watch. He jammed the pry bar under the steel container and heaved it sideways out of the grave with all the force his back and shoulders still had. The box crashed onto the dirt beside the headstone, and the ground beneath it immediately collapsed inward another 6 inches, exposing a narrower second compartment. No explosives. No blast. Something worse. A sealed field radio, an old combat notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and a strip of faded photographs bound together with black electrical tape. Cole made a broken sound that was half laugh, half despair. This is what they were guarding. Not just this, Mason said, because his eyes had already found the inside lid of the steel box. Someone had written on the underside in block marker, recent and angry in all caps, if the dog finds this, burn everything else. Ranger's snarl ripped across the grass to the west, followed by a man's scream. Then a second shot, closer, much closer. Mason spun just in time to see the runner stagger free of the grass, one sleeve shredded, pistol swinging wildly toward Ranger as the dog hit him again. Mason fired once. The runner's shoulder snapped back, and he dropped hard into the dust, but not before his shot went off. Ranger yelped, short, sharp, involuntary, and tumbled sideways. The sound drove straight through Mason's ribs. He was moving before thought caught up, sprinting low, grabbing Ranger by the harness, dragging the dog behind the angel marker as 2 more men opened up from the north field. Stone burst around them. Cole crawled to the exposed false grave compartment and clawed the oilcloth notebook and taped photographs into his shirt. Good. At least someone was thinking. Mason looked down at Ranger and felt the whole world narrow. Blood again. Front leg this time. Not shattered, but hit. The dog tried to rise anyway, tried to turn his head back toward the runner, back toward the threat, back toward duty. "No," Mason said, voice breaking harder than he wanted. "No, not this time." Ranger pressed against him, breathing fast, eyes still hot and alive, but the leg trembled under him. Loss started there. Not death, not yet, but the first sick realization that the one creature carrying this whole story forward could be taken from under him one piece at a time. Cole slid in beside them, pale and sweating. "We've got to move." Mason looked at him, then at the exposed field radio, then at the two men still advancing through the grass in disciplined intervals. "To where?" Cole's answer came too fast, like he'd known it before Mason asked. "The storm cellar under the house." Mason's eyes narrowed. "How do you know there's a storm cellar?" Cole didn't answer immediately, and that silence told Mason more than words would have. Ranger growled low at Cole again, even hurt, even shaking. There it was. Another fracture. Another thing not said. Another lie by omission opening at exactly the wrong time. "You've been here before," Mason said. Cole's face went gray in a different way now, not from blood loss. "Years ago." "Doing what?" "Cleaning." The word landed like a slap. Mason stared at him. Another shot cracked past, chewing bark off the mesquite over their heads, but for a second that didn't matter either. Cleaning. Not rescue. Not recovery. Cleaning. Cole looked away first. "I came after the first burial," he said. "I wasn't the one who ordered it, but I was here when they moved material off the ranch and hid what they couldn't risk transporting." Mason felt something dark and old shift inside his chest. "Material?" Cole swallowed. "Proof." Ranger barked once at the field, once at the house, then tried to pull in that direction with the stubborn fury of a dog who would drag himself across glass if it meant getting his man moving. Mason looked at the dog, at the blood on the front leg, at the false grave torn open behind them, at the oilcloth notebook disappearing under Cole's shirt, and made the only decision left. He slung Ranger's front half up against his shoulder, supporting the wounded leg, grabbed the field radio and photographs with his free hand, and shoved Cole toward the house. "Cellar! Now!" They ran bent low between graves and mesquite while bullets snapped over the markers. The house looked different from that angle, less like a dying ranch home, more like a bunker with its age worn thin. Ranger growled the whole way, not from pain, but toward the field line, tracking every shift of the men behind them. Halfway to the porch, the old field radio in Mason's hand crackled to life with a burst of static so sudden it nearly made him drop it. Then a voice came through, distorted but clear enough to freeze all three of them mid-stride. "You're already too late," it said. Mason knew that voice. Not from this morning. Not from the men in the field. From much farther back. From briefings and rotor wash and one night overseas, he had spent years trying to file under smoke and noise. The radio hissed again. "If Cole reached you," the voice continued, "then he brought you exactly where we wanted." Mason stared at the radio as if it had bitten him. Cole's face emptied out. Ranger's growl deepened into something almost feral. Then the porch beneath Mason's next step gave a tiny metallic click, and in that instant he understood the shape of the failure all at once. They hadn't been driven away from the house at all. They had been driven back to it. Mason's boot froze in midair above the porch plank the instant the metallic click sounded beneath it. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just small enough to feel personal, like the house itself had chosen that moment to whisper "don't." Ranger reacted faster than thought. The black-antenned shepherd slammed sideways into Mason's knees with all the force left in his wounded body, and drove both Mason and Cole off the porch line, just as the front steps erupted in a brutal upward blast of dirt, splintered wood, and hidden nails. The shockwave punched the air out of Mason's chest and flung him shoulder first into the rain barrel. Cole hit the ground flat beside the porch stones with a cry that sounded more betrayed than hurt. Ranger rolled once through dust and smoke, then came up limping, snarling, and instantly turned not toward the porch but toward the upstairs window. Rehook. New threat. Mason followed the dog's stare and saw the muzzle flash a fraction too late. The shot tore through the porch post where his throat had been a second earlier. "Inside the second floor," Cole shouted, voice raw. "There was never just the cellar." Mason's head whipped toward him. "You knew that too?" Cole's face collapsed into something uglier than guilt. "I knew there was an observation nest. I didn't know they rearmed the house." Another shot cracked from the upstairs window. Ranger barked once, violent and directional, then lunged not for the front door, not for the shooter, but toward the crawl opening under the porch where old plumbing once ran. Mason got it immediately. Flank route. Dog first, as always. He grabbed Cole by the collar and dragged him off the yard line toward the low stone edging along the side of the house, while bullets snapped from both the field and the upstairs window, crisscrossing the ranch like somebody had been waiting years for him to step into the middle of it. The field radio he'd stuffed under his jacket crackled again, and the same familiar voice slid through static with cold, controlled amusement. "Still chasing the dog instead of the pattern," it said. Mason felt the sound hit somewhere ancient. Not memory yet. Nearer. More dangerous. The voice belonged to command, to nights under rotor wash, to orders passed through headsets in tones that never rose no matter how bad the ground became. Ranger barked again beneath the porch and disappeared into the black crawl space without hesitation. Mason dropped to one knee at the edge, shoved the radio volume low, and peered in. Darkness. Dust. Old pipes. Then, from deeper under the house, Ranger's growl began rolling back toward him, low and steady, not attack growl, not warning growl. Tracking growl. He's got something, Mason thought. Or someone. Cole crawled up beside him, breathing through pain. "If he found the access hatch, it will come up behind the stairs," he whispered. Mason turned on him hard. "Why do you know the inside routes of my uncle's house better than I do?" Cole shut his eyes once, as if he'd been dreading that exact question longer than the bullets. "Because it stopped being your uncle's house a long time before he died." Mason stared at him. Another shot tore brick from the chimney. Another from the field slapped the barn wall. The whole ranch had become a kill box, and still that sentence hit hardest. "Say it straight," Cole swallowed. "Your uncle didn't lose this ranch to debt. He was paid to hold it." Ranger barked once from under the house. Sharp. Urgent. Mason's pulse kicked harder. "Hold what?" Cole looked toward the false graves, toward the blown pump shed, toward the dry well that had opened the morning like a wound. "Everything they couldn't move. Everything tied to the mission after it went wrong. Storage. Silence. Recovery routes. Men came through here for years. Your uncle kept records, burial points, fuel radios. He called it ranch work. We called it quiet maintenance." Mason felt something inside him go cold and perfectly still. His whole adult life he had pictured this property as the last honest thing left in his family. A broken place, yes, but real. Workable. Hard. Now that illusion cracked wide enough to see the structure underneath it. The dry well, the false graves, the cellar trap, the observation nest, the hidden caches, the route somebody still knew by memory. The ranch was not a refuge. It was a depot. A buried extension of the same operation that had ruined him. Major reveal building. Ranger's growl under the house changed abruptly. Closer now, more violent. Then came a shout from inside the crawl space, muffled and furious. Human. Mason didn't wait. He shoved the pistol into his teeth, dropped flat, and crawled into the darkness after the dog. Dust filled his nostrils instantly. The space was tighter than he remembered from childhood, low beams forcing his shoulders down, old pipes rattling overhead, as gunfire continued outside in dull, vibrating thuds. Ahead, Ranger had a man pinned halfway through a square hatch cut up into the floorboards beneath the rear stair landing. The attacker's upper body was above floor level, but his right leg was trapped below, and Ranger had locked onto the back of the thigh and refused to let go. The man was clawing at the hatch edge with one hand and reaching blindly downward with the other for a pistol he dropped in the crawl dirt. Mason surged forward, caught the wrist, and drove the man's face into the floor beam hard enough to daze him. Ranger released on command and shifted instantly to the chest, pitting him with both forelegs and a snarl that made the whole underhouse space vibrate. Mason grabbed the fallen pistol, kicked it away, and hauled the attacker down through the hatch into the crawl space. Young. Not one of the old hands. Fresh beard. Fresh fear. Burn mark on one sleeve from the pump shed blast. The runner. The one Ranger had hit at the water tank. Up close, he looked less like a mastermind and more like a courier who had just realized he'd been sent into a story older and uglier than he'd been told. Mason jammed the captured pistol under his jaw. "Who's on the radio?" The man spat blood, then laughed once from pure nerves. "You still don't know?" Ranger's growl deepened. Mason leaned in until the steel touched teeth. "Name." The man's eyes flicked to Cole, who had just reached the crawl opening and was watching with a face gone empty. That look told Mason the truth a beat before the words arrived. "Ask him," the runner whispered. "He used to call him sir." Cole went dead still. Outside, a round punched through the wall above them and showered dust down into the crawl space. Mason did not blink. "Cole?" His voice was quieter now, which made it worse. Cole's face crumpled inward, not theatrically, just the way exhausted structures fail after carrying too much weight too long. "I never called him that in the field," he said. "Only after." Mason's stomach dropped. The runner laughed again, uglier this time. "After the reports. After the cleanup. After the promotions." Ranger barked once straight into the runner's face, and the man flinched so hard he struck the beam above him. Mason's hands were steady now in a way that always meant danger had gone past fear and into action. "Say it." Cole looked him in the eye at last, and Mason saw the final shape of the truth there before the words even formed. "The voice on the radio," Cole said. "The one who ordered fallback on the coast, the one who signed the containment logs, the one who kept this ranch alive after the mission. He wasn't some distant handler." Dust drifted through the narrow beam of light from the hatch above them. Ranger's teeth showed. The runner smiled like a man watching a controlled burn finally reach the dry part of the field. Then Cole finished it, and the whole buried story snapped into a new shape at once. "It was your uncle." Mason yanked his foot back so hard he nearly fell, and the second it cleared the porch plank, the hidden charge underneath it blew. Not a full house killer. A directional trap. Enough to turn the front steps into a burst of splintered wood, nails, and dirt. Enough to tear through anyone charging the entrance without flattening the structure they still wanted to use. The blast hammered across the yard and lit the porch in one dirty orange flash. Ranger was already moving before the sound finished, dragging his wounded body sideways into the grass, and pulling Mason with the old invisible leash that had saved him more than once in places no one came home from clean. Cole hit the dirt hard beside the stone edging, arm over his face, while debris rained across the yard and the upstairs shooter opened up again, rounds cracking through smoke and porch dust as if the trap had been only the starting pistol. Mason rolled behind the broken water trough and came up with the pistol out, chest heaving, one ear ringing, his eyes already tracking windows, angles, lines of fire. Ranger crouched low against the trough shadow, hackles raised, blood dark along his side and front leg. But the dog's stare was not on the blown steps anymore. It was fixed on the left side of the house, beneath the kitchen window, where old latticework covered the crawl vent. Rehook. New route. "You see another way in," Mason muttered. Ranger barked once, sharp, impatient yes. The field radio crackled against Mason's ribs again, and his dead uncle's voice slid through static with the same calm tone that had once sent men forward and back across hot ground, as if lives were just markers on a map. "Still letting the dog lead," it said. "That was always your weakness." Mason felt rage rise so clean and cold it almost helped. He dragged the radio free, thumbed the volume up, and said into it, "You're dead," Static hissed. Then, "And yet here you are, standing on my porch." A round snapped off the trough rim and showered Mason's cheek with rust. Ranger growled deeper. The shooter upstairs had adjusted again. Good. Let him think Mason was still pinned here. Mason grabbed Cole by the shoulder and shoved him lower. "Cellar access under the house?" Cole coughed dust and blood into his sleeve, then nodded toward the crawl vent. "Old service hatch under the kitchen. If they kept the original route, it'll connect to the storm room under the pantry." Mason's eyes narrowed. "If—" Cole met his stare with the empty exhaustion of a man who knew every answer he gave cost him something. "If your uncle didn't redesign it after my last visit." Ranger barked again, and then, to Mason's surprise, turned suddenly away from the house and stared across the yard toward the barn. Not the field. Not the porch. The barn. Mason followed the line of the dog's stare and saw the smallest movement through the warped slats of the upper hayloft. A second muzzle. Another shooter. Not just upstairs in the house. Crossfire from the barn too. The whole ranch really was a layered kill box. "Down!" Mason barked, though Cole was already flat. The loft rifle cracked, and a round tore through the trough wall where Mason's ribs had been. Ranger snapped his head back toward the crawl vent immediately after, as if saying yes, see it, now move. Mason did. He ripped two old bolts from the trough frame, flung one toward the porch, and the other toward the barn doors. Both shooters answered instantly. Good. Split their timing. He rose in the tiny gap between shots, grabbed Cole under one arm, and ran bent low toward the lattice vent with Ranger limping ahead through the weeds. Dirt spat at their heels. A window above shattered outward. The barn rifle fired again, too low this time. Ranger reached the vent first and began clawing at the rottenwood not wildly, but in quick focused strikes at one exact corner. Mason hit the lattice with the pry bar from the false grave cache and ripped it free in one wrenching pull. Under it sat a square hatch of warped planks, half hidden by ivy and dust, with a rusted ring handle sunk flush to the wood. Ranger backed away one step and barked directly at it. Mason grabbed the ring and pulled. Nothing. Swollen shut. Another round punched brick above the hatch and sprayed mortar into his hair. Cole, still half on his knees, shoved the weathered K9 vest under the ring for padding and said, "Use the bar through it." Mason jammed the pry bar through the ring and hauled with both hands. The hatch shrieked upward, releasing a rush of stale, cold air from below that smelled like damp stone, old fuel, and the kind of sealed darkness that had kept too many secrets too long. Ranger dropped in first without hesitation. Mason swore. "No!" Too late. The dog vanished into black. Rehook. Fear. Mason thrust the pistol ahead of him, dropped after the dog, and hit a narrow dirt ramp that fell steeply under the kitchen. Cole slid in behind, dragging the hatch mostly shut above them just as rounds hammered the outer wall where they'd been crouched. Darkness swallowed the gunfire to a dull pounding thud. Mason clicked on the flashlight and found Ranger 10 feet ahead, standing rigid in a low tunnel with old stone walls and timber braces, body pointed toward a heavy wooden door banded in iron at the far end. The dog was not barking now. He was listening. Mason could hear it too after a second, a faint mechanical hum from behind the door, regular and wrong, like an old generator or a fan running where no power should still exist. Cole slid down the dirt slope and nearly fell, catching himself on the wall with a hiss of pain. "Storm room?" he whispered. Mason swept the beam past him. Shelves cut into stone. Empty fuel cans. Rotting crates. A rack where tools once hung, now bare except for one rusted bolt cutter. This place had been used, cleared, maintained, emptied in parts. Not an old family cellar. A live route. A bunker line. The hum behind the iron-banded door deepened, and then another sound reached them beneath it. Voices. Not from the radio. Real. Human. More than one. On the other side of the door. Mason killed the flashlight instantly. Ranger's growl began again, low and vibrating. Mason crouched, one hand on the dog's harness, the other lifting the radio back toward his mouth. "You want me in the house so badly," he said quietly into the static. "Why?" For the first time, the answer did not come instantly. When it did, the dead voice sounded closer than before, almost pleased. "Because some truths only make sense in the room where they started." A tiny click sounded from the iron-banded door. Then another. Not mechanical now. A lock being turned from the inside. Cole's breath stopped beside him. Ranger's growl sharpened into a warning rumble that rolled through the tunnel like distant thunder. Mason raised the pistol toward the seam of the door just as it began to open inward by 1 inch, then 2, and a wedge of yellow light spilled into the black cellar, carrying with it the smell of old paper, cigarette smoke, and something far worse, freshly cleaned gun oil. Someone stepped into the gap, not rushed, not afraid, just calm enough to make Mason's blood go cold. It was not one of the field shooters. Not the barn rifle. Not the runner. An older man filled the narrow opening, broad-shouldered even with age, gray at the temples, his face carved by years Mason had never gotten to see closely enough. The pistol at his hand was low, almost polite. The half-smile on his mouth was the same one Mason had seen in family photographs every summer of his childhood. And when Ranger saw him, the dog did not bark. He made a broken sound from deep in his chest and stepped backward. "Easy," the man said, as if they were all still standing in sunlight at some family barbecue that had never truly existed. "You've come far enough, nephew." Mason did not lower the pistol when the older man opened the storm room door. He stepped into the wedge of yellow light anyway, one hand low on the gun, the other half raised like he was approaching a frightened animal instead of his own nephew at the end of a kill maze. Up close, the years hit harder than the resemblance. More gray in the hair than the photographs had ever held. A deeper drag at one corner of the mouth. Burn marks on the knuckles. But the eyes were the same calm hard eyes that had once passed biscuits across a summer porch and later, apparently, fallback orders across dead radios. Ranger made that broken chest-deep sound again and backed up another step, not out of fear, but out of the terrible confusion reserved for familiar scents dragged through places they should never have been. "Inside," the older man said. "3 more are moving on the crawl line, and the barn shooter has angle on this tunnel mouth." Mason kept the gun centered on his chest. "Say your name." The older man's half-smile vanished. "You know my name. Say it." A beat. Then, quietly, "Uncle Aaron." Cole exhaled like a man hearing a verdict he had spent years expecting. Another shot hammered the outer wall above them, showering dust into the tunnel. Aaron stepped back from the door, leaving the room open. "You can kill me after you listen," he said. "But if you keep standing there, You'll never know which parts one buried for them and which parts one buried for you. Mason wanted to shoot him for that sentence alone. Wanted to put a round straight through the calm in his face and call it overdue. But Ranger had stopped retreating. The dog stood rigid now, ears forward, staring not at Aaron's hands, not at the weapon, but past him into the room beyond. That look was enough. Mason shoved Cole ahead, kept the pistol high, and followed the dog through the door. The storm room was not a cellar. It was a nerve center pretending to be one. Radios, wall maps, old monitors, metal cabinets with coded labels, a long work table covered in weathered binders, sealed envelopes, burner phones, dog tags, photographs, and one battered tape deck with fresh reels already threaded. The hum Mason had heard in the tunnel came from a compact generator under the far desk. On the back wall hung two K9 vests. One was the weather-faded Echo vest from the false grave. The other was newer, black, empty of name. Mason's throat tightened. "This is what the ranch really was," Aaron said. "Relay point. Storage. Sanitization site when the coast job went bad. After that, it became a graveyard for evidence no one trusted anyone else to move." Mason looked at the walls, the files, the cables running into stone, and felt the last clean memory of this place die in him without ceremony. "You let it happen." Aaron took that without blinking. "Yes." No excuse. No dodge. Just yes. The honesty of it somehow hurt worse than denial would have. Cole sank into the chair by the table like his bad leg had finally decided enough was enough. "He didn't build it," he muttered. "He inherited it after command turned dirty." Aaron's gaze slid to him. "And you still came back." "I came back because you said the dog would find him." Cole shot back. "You said if the dog was still alive, he'd hear the well." Ranger barked once at that, hard, abrupt, almost offended by being discussed instead of followed. Mason's head snapped toward the dog. Ranger was at the base of the work table now, nose pressed to the floorboards beneath the tape deck, body tense in a way Mason had seen before only when the dog could hear something men missed entirely. A voice. A breath. A compartment. "What is he hearing?" Mason asked. Aaron's face changed for the first time. Not fear. Recognition. "The same thing he heard on the coast," he said. "Voices traveling through Earth." Mason felt the room go colder. Aaron crossed to the tape deck slowly, as though any fast move might get him shot, and touched the reel but did not start it. "You want the answer clean? Here it is. I took fallback orders that night from a command cell I knew was dirty, and I followed them. I told myself it was chain, survival, containment, anything that made the next hour bearable. Afterward, I learned what they were protecting wasn't a target package. It was a payment ledger tied to men on our side. Routes, names, offshore numbers, domestic drop sites. The mission was never supposed to end clean, because too many uniforms were already bought." Mason kept the gun up, but his hand had gone numb around it. "So you faked your death?" "No," Aaron said. "They filed me dead after I refused the second cleanup." He looked around the room. "I let the lie stand because it was the first useful thing they'd done for me." Rehook. Major truth, but not the whole of it. Mason knew it. Ranger knew it too. The dog left the table, trotted to a steel locker in the corner, then spun and barked at Aaron with furious insistence. Aaron closed his eyes for one brief, exhausted second. "There's one more thing," he said. "Of course there is," Mason said. Aaron unlocked the steel locker and pulled out a narrow weatherproof tube no longer than a forearm. He set it on the table between them. Inside, cushioned in foam, lay a mini-reel canister, a handwritten ledger key, and a sealed evidence card bearing official chain of custody markings from the original mission date. Mason stared. This was it. Not fragments. Not copies. Original proof. Enough to put names to every half-buried lie on the ranch. Enough to crack the operation open. Near enough to resolution that Mason felt it in his bones, like the first breath after surfacing. Aaron saw it happen in his face and shook his head once. "Not enough on its own," he said. "The reel in that canister gives you voices. The key gives you accounts. But the master ledger, the one with the signatures, never stayed here." Mason's jaw locked. "Where?" Aaron looked toward the floorboards. Ranger barked again, even sharper, claws scraping wood now. "Under us," Aaron said. "Old irrigation tunnel. Runs from this room to the dry well." Mason's pulse kicked hard. "You hid it in the well." "I hid it below the well cap in a side pocket where sound carries," Aaron said. "Only way to protect it was to bury it where no man would search first, but a trained dog would never stop hearing it." The title of the whole day snapped shut around the truth at last, and for one savage second Mason almost laughed at the cruelty of it. Of course Ranger had barked. Of course the dog had heard the hollow beneath the hollow, the voice behind the voice, the final secret behind the bait they'd all been fighting over since dawn. Aaron touched the tape deck. "I set the radio loop to pull you toward the right paths if anyone reactivated the ranch. The men outside thought they were driving you. I was trying to keep you alive long enough for the dog to finish what the rest of us ruined." Cole let out a raw breath. "Then why is the master ledger not already in your hand?" Aaron's face darkened. "Because somebody got into the tunnel 10 minutes ago." Silence. Then a sound rose through the floorboards, faint, metallic, unmistakable. A bucket wheel turning somewhere below them in the dark. Ranger lunged toward the far wall and exploded into barking, every strand of him suddenly electric. Mason didn't need anyone to explain it. Someone was already under the house, moving through the irrigation line toward the dry well, not to hide the truth now, but to pull the last piece of it out before Mason ever laid hands on it. Aaron reached for the tunnel map on the wall. Mason reached for the ledger tube. And from somewhere beneath their boots, deep in the earth where the dog had been hearing it all day, a man's voice echoed up through the boards in a strained, triumphant shout. "I've got it!" Mason moved before the echo of that shout finished rolling under the floorboards. He hit the tunnel hatch beside the storm room table with a pry bar, ripped it open, and a blast of cold, damp air rose from below carrying mud, rust, and the same hollow underground note Ranger had been hearing since the first bark at the well. The dog was down the ladder before Mason's boot touched the first rung, wounded front leg dragging slightly, but the rest of him all force and focus, black and tan fur flashing in the yellow light as he vanished into the irrigation tunnel. "Cole, the tape deck!" Aaron snapped behind him, voice suddenly back in command but stripped of all old authority. "Reel one, then the numbers packet. Send everything." Mason heard Cole limping for the table, heard drawers slam, heard the reel click into motion, and then he was in the tunnel with the pistol in one hand and the ledger tube jammed under his arm, chasing the sound of Rangers barking through a low stone throat cut under the ranch years before Mason ever knew his uncle's hands were dirty. The tunnel bent hard left, then narrowed, muddy water black around his boots, roots hanging through the ceiling like veins. Ahead, Ranger's bark changed from pursuit to contact. Mason rounded the bend and saw the man at once, one of the field shooters, bigger than the runner, heavier in the shoulders, crouched knee-deep in filthy water beside a crumbling side pocket in the tunnel wall. In his hands was the master ledger, oilcloth ripped open, papers exposed, one corner already blackening under the blue kiss of a butane torch. "Stop!" Mason roared, but the man only looked up, calm as a butcher, and drove the flame lower. Ranger hit him mid-motion. The torch flew. The ledger dropped into the water with a wet slap. The shooter twisted and hammered the dog with a metal torch canister, then grabbed for a knife at his belt. Mason fired once in the tunnel, and the blast became thunder. The round took the man high in the shoulder and spun him sideways into the wall, but not down. He came back with the knife anyway, because men like that always did. Ranger launched again, caught the wrist before the blade could reach Mason's throat, and the whole fight turned into mud, breath, teeth, and stone. Mason hit them both shoulder first, drove the man down into the water, and felt the knife scrape across his jacket instead of skin. The shooter jammed an elbow into Mason's jaw, got half a knee under him, and snarled through blood. "You still think this was about one mission?" Mason answered by slamming his forehead into the man's face hard enough to turn the question into a grunt. Ranger shifted grip from wrist to forearm, holding the knife arm offline with desperate fury, while Mason shoved the pistol under the man's chin. "The ledger," he hissed. "Where's the rest?" The shooter smiled through broken teeth, and that smile told Mason the worst thing first. "Everywhere." Then he tried to twist the knife down into Ranger's neck with the last of his strength. Mason fired. The sound in the tunnel became one brutal flash of finality. The man went still beneath them. Ranger released it once and backed off on command, breathing hard, muzzle wet, eyes still searching for the next threat. Mason grabbed the ledger from the water. One edge was charred, another soaked through, but the signatures were still there, block after block of names, dates, accounts, and authorizations. Real. Original. Enough to burn half a hidden network to the ground. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt the tremor in Ranger's wounded leg and dropped instantly to check the dog. "Let me see," he whispered, hands on fur, on blood, on the hot living proof that had carried him through every layer of this day. The front leg was worse now, grazed deep and swelling, but not shattered. The side wound had opened again. Ranger licked once at Mason's wrist, impatient even now, then turned his head sharply back toward the hatch above. Footsteps. More than one. Closing from the storm room. Mason rose with the ledger in one hand and the pistol in the other, expecting betrayal, expecting one more ugly turn, but what came down the ladder was Aaron first, gun low, face gray with something heavier than age. Behind him came Cole with the real box under one arm, and the weathered echo vest clutched against his side. "Transmission's out," Cole said, breathless. "County, bureau, press line, all of it. Every packet Aaron cached, every audio file, every call sign. This place is lit up now." Aaron's eyes dropped to the body in the water, then to the ledger in Mason's hand, and for a long second he looked like a man who had been waiting years to see one specific piece of paper survive long enough to hate him properly. Above them, from somewhere outside the house, came the distant rising whine of approaching sirens. Then, farther off still, rotors. The network had finally lost the one thing it needed most: silence. Mason kept the gun up anyway. "You don't get absolution because you helped at the end," he said. Aaron nodded once. "I know." There was no defense in it. No self-forgiveness. Just truth stripped bare at last. Cole leaned against the tunnel wall, pale and shaking, then looked at Mason with the raw open face of a man who had spent too long inside wrong orders. "He kept the recordings," he said quietly. "Not to protect himself. To make sure one day somebody could prove the dog was right." Mason looked down at Ranger. The shepherd stood between all three men, chest heaving, mud to the knees, blood in the fur, and still somehow the strongest thing in that tunnel. All day long men had lied, hidden, staged, buried, looped voices through radios, rigged wells, trapped porches, and built false graves. The only thing that had remained exact from first moment to last was the dog's instinct. Bark at the well. Turn from the field. Freeze at the vent. Hear the tunnel. Find the ledger. Ranger had not just saved Mason again. He had dragged the truth, piece by piece, out of the earth. The sirens grew louder. So did the rotors. Above, somebody shouted from the yard. One of the remaining field men trying to flee, maybe. Aaron heard it too. "There's a second exit," he said. "Comes out behind the windmill. You take the ledger and the dog. I'll meet them in the open." Mason's stare hardened. "Why would I trust you to meet anyone?" Aaron looked at him, then at Ranger, and something in his face finally broke free of command, of concealment, of whatever he had been forcing himself to be for all these years. "Because I'm tired," he said. "And because if I run now, then everything the dog dragged back into daylight dies with me." It was not redemption. It was simply the first useful truth Aaron had offered as a man instead of as an operator. Mason held his gaze for one long breath, then gave the slightest nod. Aaron climbed back toward the house. Cole followed slower, carrying the vest, dragging the ruined leg, but moving toward the light anyway. Mason tucked the ledger inside his jacket, crouched beside Ranger, and pressed his forehead gently to the dog's for 1 second that felt larger than the whole tunnel. "One more push," he whispered. Ranger gave a tired low huff and leaned into him. Together they took the windmill exit and came up into dawn. The ranch yard was no longer silent now. Deputies were already pouring through the broken gate. Federal vehicles were bouncing off the dirt road in a wash of dust and flashing lights. Men were shouting commands. One of the field shooters was face down, near the fence under 2 rifles. The barn loft had gone quiet. On the porch, smoke still curled from the blown steps. And there, in the center of it all, Aaron stood with both hands visible, and a pistol laid on the dirt at his feet, while agents advanced on him from 3 angles. He did not look toward Mason. He looked toward Ranger. Just once. The dog met the look without barking, without growling, only watching with that grave unreadable stillness dogs have when they know more than the living deserve. Then the cuffs went on. Hours later, after statements, after medics, after the storm room had been emptied crate by crate and the false graves opened under cameras and evidence tags, Mason sat on the back step of an ambulance with Ranger's bandaged leg across his lap and the black Antan shepherd's heavy head resting against his thigh. The sun had climbed high enough to burn the last blue out of the fields. Men in gloves moved through the ranch like they were excavating a ruin. In a way, they were. Cole, wrapped and limping, was giving a second statement beside a patrol truck. Aaron had not asked to speak to Mason again. Mason was grateful for that. Some reckonings did not need another conversation. They needed records, signatures, dates, witnesses, and the cold weight of a ledger laid on a metal table where no one could bury it twice. Ranger opened his eyes and looked up at him, tired but clear, and laid one paw over Mason's wrist with the same exact pressure he had used at the well, at the grave, at every wrong turn where Mason's human mind had lagged behind the dog's simpler, cleaner truth. Mason let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. The title of the day, the hook of it, the whole impossible chain began and ended in that one gesture. Ex-military dog kept barking at the dry well. Then the seal looked down. That was how the story opened. But it was not where it ended. It ended here, in morning light, with the lie torn open, the dead speaking through records, the bought men exposed, the ranch no longer pretending to be innocent, and the one creature who had never once wavered finally allowed to rest. Mason bowed his head into Ranger's fur and, for the first time since the coast, let gratitude hurt more than guilt. The dog had not just saved his life. He had saved the part of Mason that might still deserve one. And as the sun climbed over the broken windmill and the agents carried the last evidence boxes out of the house, Ranger closed his eyes again, still touching Mason's wrist, and the old ranch, at last, stopped sounding like a grave.